So I'm going to assume, despite Daniel's duty, that we all believe we'd like a world federation or a global parliament. And then I'd like to discuss just two things. How do we get there from here? How do we actually achieve a global parliament? And then a little bit about what we're doing on the local scenes of representing the local movement. So up there is a picture from the Democratic World Federalists website in California, showing 4 routes to a world federation. And it's a bit misleading. It's not a walk through flowery meadows. The landscape should be littered with cliffs and crevasses and
a few bodies, perhaps.
Yes, probably. And the peak should be the size of Mount Everest. You know, it's a huge undertaking. We're talking uniting 200 nations and 7 billion people. So, yeah, unfortunately, it's probably a long-term project. Anyway, of those 4 paths, the first thing to say is nobody knows where the eventual breakthrough will come. So we have to sort of press forward as a movement along all avenues. But on the other hand, we should think about what's the most likely. So I'm going to say just a few words about each of those. First, on the right, there's create a world constitution. So that's for the enthusiasts. Let's hold a constitutional convention next month, draw up a constitution for the Federation of the Earth, and implement it the month after, which would be nice, but it's, well, I would say not practical. You have to have essentially universal acceptance before you can do that. And if you had a poll, well, I'm not sure, I was going to say, I would guess, a wild guess, that maybe 2 to 5% of the population would say we're ready to do that. So basically, in my opinion, that would be the last step in the process, not the first step in the process. Second one, integrate the regions, second on the left. I understand that in 1947, at the height of the movement, the Europeans split off from the rest and said, let's do Europe first. And indeed, they've had great success. So we've seen the process leading to the present European Union. And I agree, I think it's the most important and most interesting development in global politics since World War II. But unfortunately, it's not really clear how to get beyond this. We have an African Union forming. We have a South American Union on the drawing boards, but the rest of the world hasn't sorted out what they want to do. And how you go from there to a world federation is just a bit unclear. I think we would get there in the end by that route, but be long term, and it's not clear how we do it. So basically, I guess I'm saying we should be working in parallel to create a world state, if you like. Then we come to the left-hand route, transform the United Nations. So that's the obvious route, and that's what the movement has always concentrated on. Work on the premier organ of UN governance we have at present, and try to change it for our purposes. And there have been many, many proposals over the years. They've also always come up against this great barrier, this great cliff of the UN Charter. The UN Charter is like a national constitution. It takes 2/3 of the member states and all 5 permanent members to change it. We've never succeeded. I think the Charter provides for a Charter Review Conference, but there's never even been a Charter Review Conference up till now. So we're striking that huge barrier. So of recent times, I guess the movement has lowered its sights a bit and said, what can we do without requiring a change in the UN Charter? And Joseph will be able to correct me on this, but the strategy was to form coalitions of NGOs to promote change. First of all, the International Criminal Court, and secondly, the responsibility to protect. And both times the campaigns succeeded brilliantly. So in that respect, they've done great things. And right now, the most lively campaign is the campaign for UNPA, and certainly I hope we would all support that. But I would argue that the easiest and most likely route is actually that third one, or second from the right, unite the democracies. Mainly because it allows the same strategy as the Europeans used, with no great barrier. There's no charter or constitution to block the way. So, right, I've said already. Yes, so reforming the UN, the most lively campaign at the moment is the campaign for United Nations Parliamentary Assembly. Uniting democracies, move on, allows the same strategy as Jean Monnet and his friends used in Europe. And their strategy then basically was to start with a smaller number of progressive states. Don't demand everybody be a member to begin with. So in their case it was the original 6. Begin with a limited objective, not necessarily demanding the whole box and dice, so they started with the European coal and steel community, and then evolve stage by stage by means of successive treaties, the Paris Treaty, the Rome Treaty, Maastricht, etc., to reach the present stage of a European Union and a European Parliament. And you know, they really achieved a huge amount, despite all the difficulties we've been discussing. I think we can be pretty confident there will never again be a war between France and Germany, or indeed a war within Western Europe. And that was the major motivation for the whole process, right? All right, so turning back to the global scene, I think we mostly agree that democracy has to be a basic principle. You need democracy to ensure against tyranny, to maintain human rights, ... So most of us would take that as a fundamental principle. So if you're following the European strategy with a smaller group, then let's start with the democracies. Start with the democracies and aim to progress from there stage by stage. And that leads you to think the first stage might be a world community of democracies on the lines of the European community. And so far I think that's a fairly strong argument. Then comes the difficult question, what should be the basis of such a community that would attract supporters, I suppose? Ideally it should be an economic community, as the European one was, in order to attract new members, if you like. But personally I see it's very, well, I find it very hard to see a real need or an opportunity for that right now, in that free trade has been sort of almost done to death. Whereas on the other hand, I think there is a need and an opportunity for a security community. So let me explore that a bit. So basically here, the idea would be a reform of NATO, basically, possibly including the OECD as well, to form a world security community of democratic nations. So NATO is already made up of democracies. What needs to happen is a refocus, which has already happened. NATO lost its main raison d'etre, I suppose, when the Soviet Union collapsed, and it's been searching for a new purpose and indeed has been taking on a role as the global security and peacekeeping arm of its members. So it sort of led the international effort in Afghanistan, Libya, Kosovo. But then it should be open. So the President's confined to North America and Europe. Why not open to other democracies around the globe, such as Australia, such as New Zealand, such as Japan, such as India, perhaps. And then look, over time, as nations turn democratic, we can bring them in. And there have been various proposals. Prime Ministers of France and Spain, for instance, spring to mind. Next, introduce a qualified majority voting system along the European lines. At present, NATO operates under consensus, and that causes a lot of problems. They have difficulty reaching decisions, and getting anything done. The military men especially have been very frustrated, and there's been several proposals from them for some sort of qualified majority system or an opt-out system or whatever. Next, so it's a security community, undertakes peacekeeping actions, undertakes reconstruction actions, but it should only operate in outside territory if authorised to do so by the Security Council. That's actually international law, so that's part of the UN Charter, but it should be explicitly acknowledged by the new community. Next, it would be a good idea to follow the European Union and provide funds, structural adjustment funds, to bring less advanced members of the community up to speed economically, and that's where the OECD could come in. A new Marshall Plan could be brought in under the new community, and that would give a big motivation for new members to join and for the thing to expand to eventually become universal. So this is sort of an exercise in state building, state design. Then structurally, so the EU or the ECSC, right from the start, had elements in it looking forward to a European federation. It had an assembly where spokespeople could give their opinions. It had a court even though the coal and steel community had no obvious need for that. So in the same way, a court should be able to adjudicate disputes between the members, settle any dispute between the members would have to be settled peacefully, and it could adjudicate on matters, if you like, of community law. So that would be the basis of a sort of legal system. And then that would be about all institutionally. There already exists the North Atlantic Assembly, which is rather like Andreas's idea, an assembly made up of parliamentarians from member states, which could form the nucleus of a real parliament in the long term. So that's the outline. As far as I can see, it has advantages from virtually every point of view. It's a sort of win-win proposition. Okay, I'm obviously biased, but that's my opinion. E.g., the USA. It would allow a sharing of the responsibility and the costs of acting as global policemen, if you like, which the US tried to do a decade ago and rather fell flat on its face. No one country has the right to do that in any case. So, and there's been a lot of discussions about that. In fact, there's been propositions somewhat along these lines from both sides of politics in the US. Not exactly this, but John McCain on the Republican side talked about a League of Democracies, and Ivo Daalder, James Lindsay, people like that talked about a concert, democracies. So this would chime in with those ideas, which means a scheme like this would have a chance of being approved by both sides in the US. And without the US, we really can't get anywhere. For Europe, well, they're already used to multinational ventures like this, so they should be happy with it. It would more or less solve the dilemma on defence, collective defence. They could rely on this community for defence, and they don't have to worry about whether they keep up national defences or go for a European defence force or what have you. NATO itself, they've been moving in this direction. As I say, military men, actually a decade ago, made, chiefs of staff and some made a number of calls for reform along fairly similar lines. Take Australia as an example of an outsider. We've been a very close partner of NATO in e.g. Afghanistan, etc. This would give us a seat, as I say, at the top table. Our security is sort of guaranteed by our alliance with the US, but this would give us a seat at the discussion. It would give us a place in the process of global governance. Russia and China, if it was assured that NATO was not going to intervene or interfere in their affairs unless the Security Council agreed, then they would effectively have a veto over its operations externally. And that might allay their fears. Russia has a very strong fear, I guess, of NATO, what it might do. And finally, the UN, again, under that restriction, but operates only with the consent of the Security Council. This new community would essentially act as a strong right arm for the UN. I believe at the beginning it was thought the UN would have a military force of its own, something like 20 divisions. But that never happened. The Cold War put the kibosh on that. In a sense, this community would act like that, would only act when the Security Council says so, and in a sense it's obliged to act if the Security Council does say so. So I see this organisation not as competing with, but as complementary to the UN. And the long-term vision is very similar to Andreas's. This would be a big step forward on the road to some sort of democratic global governance and a global parliament. And further steps, a bit hard to foresee, but there's no obstruction along this path. And so a succession of treaties, as the Europeans have done, could take us towards the eventual goal. And I'd just like to throw in this little note, which I've circulated on the local scene. I've heard that the next US Secretary of State might be Strobe Talbot of the Brookings Institution, provided that Hillary Clinton gets in. And he's pretty sympathetic to these ideas, so he's written this book, The Great Experiment, The Story of Ancient Empires, Modern States, and the Quest for a Global Nation, which is his name for this sort of venture. And he's recently done an essay of some sort on Monet's brandy and Europe's fate. So, I'd be very encouraged if he actually made it to Secretary of State. What are we doing? So in the last 5 minutes, let me just tell you a little bit about what we're doing. There was, and I'm not sure when it started, but there was a World Federalist Association in Australia, and it was headed for many years by Keith Suter, who's a well-known author locally and international lawyer, futurist, etc. But it had sort of dwindled away to a yearly newsletter. When we came on the scene. So, 2004, we founded this World Citizens Association, which is basically, again, an association trying to promote this idea of World Federation or a global parliament. And together with Min Tam down there, we've also founded an Institute for Global Peace and Sustainable Governance, which is particularly focused on promoting research, education, etc. on these issues. We've started a program directed by Pira Wells, who's a former Secretary General of the World Federation of United Nations Associations, of model global parliaments. So it's like a model UN, but with a different premise. We've had events in Melbourne, Canberra and Sydney, and we have one coming up in Sydney in September. Here's the next one up. And it would be great if we could see one happen up here in Brisbane, but I'll leave that to the locals. Education program, so Daryl over here is particularly concerned with that. He's our current president of the World Citizens Association. He's particularly focused on trying to get more of this material into the school syllabus and preparing materials and on promoting the idea of human rights. So you'll find over there a few booklets, the Universal Declaration, and also nuclear disarmament. I think I've covered most of the major points. We've had a project for a few years of trying to form a Centre for Global Governance and International Peace to carry out academic research and teaching, and if you like, to form a base for these sort of activities. Convene conferences just like this one. So it's really great to see this thing happening willy-nilly, pop out of the ground up here at Griffith. And I forgot to congratulate the two conveners here on this really interesting event. And again, maybe we can talk more about that later. We certainly support the UNPA campaign as one of the primary efforts going on at the moment. I have to confess we haven't done a whole lot ourselves. Maybe we need Andreas to gee us up a bit. In Australia, we did have Bob Brown, the leader of the Greens, for those who aren't from here, twice proposed the UNPA in the federal parliament, and both times he was essentially laughed to scorn by the major parties who said something about, what about China or something? Anyway. And finally, we are trying to form a coalition for a world community of democratic nations. So, in other words, trying to form a little coalition to push these ideas for uniting the democracies. Very, very early stage, but we have a few members listed there. References for the one or two students we have on present. You can either look at the websites there, or I do have a paper up on the website where you can find some references. Thank you very much.